Hello and welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. I hope you're all doing well wherever you are in the world tonight. If you enjoy calm, immersive true crime stories designed to keep you intrigued and relaxed, I'd really appreciate it if you could like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It's always wonderful to connect with viewers from across the globe. To begin, we're diving into the chilling story of the West Mesa Bone Collector, a haunting mystery that gripped Albuquerque, New Mexico, and continues to baffle investigators to this day. This case is one of those rare true crimes where the darkness lingers long after the facts have surfaced, a tale of disappearance, loss, and unanswered questions. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore the haunting story behind the West Mesa murders. The West Mesa Bone Collector case begins not with a single missing person, but with a mysterious discovery on the outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico, in early 2009. It was February when a local man, out walking his dog near the vast barren lands west of the city, stumbled upon something no one could have expected: human bones, scattered beneath the dusty desert scrub. What followed would grow into one of the most haunting and complex cold cases in American history, a story of vanished women, unanswered cries, and a darkness lurking in plain sight. The West Mesa area had long been a quiet expanse, known more for its sprawling open spaces and the occasional hiker than for anything sinister. But as investigators returned to the site after that initial find, they uncovered a grim truth: the bones belonged to at least 11 women, all buried in shallow graves in an unmarked plot of desert land. The shock was profound. Here was a mass burial site, the final resting place of women who had disappeared without explanation, many from Albuquerque's most vulnerable communities. The women discovered were not random strangers. Most were young, many in their 20s or early 30s, and a large number struggled with addiction, poverty, or involvement in the city's underground world of sex work. Their names: Tina Archueta, Victoria Chavez, Angela Duran, to name just a few, had appeared in local missing persons reports, but none of their disappearances had been linked before. At first, law enforcement struggled to piece together the threads. Who had put these women here? How had they vanished so quietly that even their loved ones had limited information about their final days? The discovery ignited a media frenzy, but it also raised difficult questions about the intersection of race, class, and justice. Many of the women were Native American or Latina, part of communities that often feel overlooked by the broader system. As forensic teams combed the site, the grim task of identification began. Some remains were nearly skeletal, complicating efforts to match DNA or gather physical evidence. Yet, through persistent detective work and community involvement, identities slowly emerged. Families who had waited years, sometimes decades, for answers now faced the cruel reality that their missing loved ones were not simply lost but victims of foul play. In the months following the discovery, investigators pursued leads, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and poring over countless tips. The theory of a serial killer, the so-called West Mesa Bone Collector, began to take hold. The women's disappearances spanned years, often following similar patterns: last seen leaving clubs or working the streets, then never heard from again. But no suspect was ever formally charged, and the case remains open, its darkest corners still unexplored. The haunting nature of the West Mesa case is not just in the crime itself, but in what it reveals about society's blind spots. These women lived on the margins, their lives complicated by addiction, poverty, and the dangers of the sex trade. Their disappearances initially received little attention, their names sometimes barely mentioned in police reports. It was only after the mass grave was found that the magnitude of the tragedy was understood. For many, this case is a painful reminder of how vulnerable populations can be exploited and discarded. It raises uncomfortable questions about police priorities, community engagement, and how missing persons cases are handled, especially when the victims do not fit the typical ideal profile. The West Mesa murders also underscore the challenge of identifying perpetrators who may exploit those vulnerabilities. Some investigators speculated the killer, or killers, may have had connections within the community or possibly even law enforcement, making the pursuit of justice all the more complicated. Despite advances in forensic science and decades of investigation, the mystery remains unsolved. Families of the victims still wait for closure, and the community continues to grapple with the implications. The desert outside Albuquerque holds its secrets tight, whispering of lives cut short and justice still to be found. In the next part, we'll explore the lives of the women behind the bones, the circumstances of their disappearances, and the broader social issues that set the stage for one of the most chilling unsolved serial murder cases in recent American history. The lives of the women buried on West Mesa were as varied and complex as the city they came from. To reduce them to mere victims is to miss the full human story that underlies this tragedy, a story filled with hope, struggle, pain, and a desperate search for survival in a world that often turned its back on them. Most of these women came from marginalized communities within Albuquerque, a city grappling with its own social and economic challenges. Native American and Latina populations are among the most vulnerable to violence, poverty, and systemic neglect in this region. Many of the women found in the desert had histories marked by trauma, addiction, and involvement in sex work, circumstances that frequently made them invisible to authorities. Tina Archueta, one of the identified victims, was a young woman with a complicated past. Her family described her as someone who battled addiction, but also as a person with a warm heart who sought to rebuild her life. Victoria Chavez was a mother of 3 who had struggled with substance abuse, yet was determined to stay close to her children. Each woman had a name, a story, and people who loved them, stories often overshadowed by stigma and misunderstanding. The disappearances began as early as 2003, with some women vanishing as late as 2005, years before the bodies were uncovered. Their last known movements were often linked to downtown Albuquerque's clubs, bars, or the notorious red light areas of the city. It was a common thread that these women had been seen last in places where vulnerability and danger intersected. Yet, despite these patterns, their cases rarely received the urgency or attention they deserved. Many went missing quietly, their families facing roadblocks or apathy when trying to get law enforcement to prioritize their searches. The system's failure to act swiftly or thoroughly allowed the killer or killers to continue their sinister work unchallenged. Some friends and family members recall the fear and frustration of those years, the slow unraveling of hope, as each missing woman seemed to fade further into the unknown. The media coverage was spotty at best, often relegated to brief mentions or buried in local news. The intersection of race, poverty, and addiction created a perfect storm for neglect. Community activists and advocacy groups, however, refused to let these women be forgotten. They pressed for increased resources, better support for families of the missing, and reforms to police procedures around disappearances. The discovery of the mass graves on West Mesa, while horrific, finally galvanized public attention and forced a reckoning with these systemic failures. Investigators pieced together the grim timeline with painstaking care. Many of the women had been reported missing by family or friends months or even years before their remains were found. Autopsies and forensic examinations revealed signs of trauma and foul play, dispelling any lingering doubts about the nature of their deaths. Still, the question of who was responsible remained elusive. With no direct witnesses and little physical evidence left at the shallow burial site, the case became a haunting puzzle. Speculation ran rampant, ranging from a single serial killer preying on vulnerable women to a more complex network of perpetrators. The theory of a lone killer emerged early, bolstered by the consistency of the burial site and the similar profiles of the victims. Dubbed the West Mesa Bone Collector, this figure, if real, appeared methodical and cold, selecting victims who were often invisible to society's protective gaze. But other theories suggested a broader conspiracy, possibly involving multiple people, or even corrupt officials who may have helped conceal the crimes. Local law enforcement faced criticism for their initial handling of the cases. Some families accused the police of bias or indifference, pointing to delayed investigations and a lack of communication. The community's trust was fractured, leaving many to question whether justice would ever be served. Complicating matters further, Albuquerque's geography and social landscape made the search for answers even harder. The desert terrain of West Mesa is vast and unforgiving, a place where secrets can easily be buried and left undiscovered for years. The transient nature of many victims' lifestyles also meant that connections were tenuous, and leads frequently dried up. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case is the way it highlights the invisibility of certain groups within society. These women's struggles with addiction or involvement in sex work became barriers to empathy and action, often overshadowing the fact that they were mothers, sisters, daughters, human beings deserving of safety and justice. As the investigation continued, the families of the victims found themselves caught in a painful limbo, grappling with grief, but also demanding answers and accountability. They organized vigils, worked with media outlets, and lobbied local officials to keep their stories alive. The West Mesa case also resonated far beyond Albuquerque. It became a stark example cited in discussions about violence against indigenous women and the systemic failures that leave many cases cold. The Native American Women's Resource Center and other advocacy groups used the tragedy to call for national reforms in how missing persons cases are handled. Despite the years that have passed, many questions remain unanswered. The killer, or killers, have never been publicly identified or caught. For the families left behind, the hope for closure is bittersweet, tempered by the reality that justice has been elusive. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the police investigation, the community's response, and the theories surrounding who might have been responsible for these chilling crimes. The discovery of the human remains on West Mesa in February 2009 sent shockwaves through Albuquerque and beyond. It was a grim revelation that confirmed what many had feared but dared not fully acknowledge: a serial killer, or possibly multiple killers, had been operating in the shadows, targeting vulnerable women and leaving their bodies to be buried in the desert. The scene was macabre and chilling, but what followed would reveal deep cracks in the investigation and the community's trust. From the start, the police investigation faced immense pressure to find answers quickly. The case had captured national attention, and public demand for justice grew louder with each passing day. Yet, investigators faced daunting obstacles. The crime scene was sprawling and remote, consisting of rough desert terrain, where scavengers and weather had taken a toll on the remains. This made forensic analysis difficult and time-consuming. What investigators did have was a pattern: a series of bodies buried in shallow graves, clustered in an area just a few miles from Albuquerque's city limits. Many of the women appeared to share similar profiles. They were young, often involved in sex work, struggling with addiction, and many were from Native American or Latina backgrounds. This suggested the possibility of a single perpetrator, or group selecting victims based on opportunity and vulnerability. But despite these clues, the case quickly became complicated. There were no eyewitnesses, no clear suspects, and limited forensic evidence pointing to the identity of the killer. The methods used to kill and dispose of the victims varied, adding to the mystery. Some showed signs of blunt force trauma, others strangulation, and some bodies were so decomposed that cause of death was impossible to determine. The initial investigation also revealed troubling gaps in how law enforcement had handled reports of missing women. Many families expressed frustration at the lack of urgency and follow-through in the years before the discovery. Several missing persons reports had been filed but never fully investigated, with some police officers assuming these women had simply disappeared by choice or fallen victim to their risky lifestyles. This institutional apathy became a central theme in the narrative surrounding the West Mesa bone collector case. It raised uncomfortable questions about how society values, and often fails, its most vulnerable members. Families demanded accountability, accusing authorities of neglect and bias. They argued that had their loved ones been from more privileged backgrounds, or had not been labeled as high risk, the police might have acted differently. Community activists and advocacy organizations amplified these concerns. Groups like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women (MMIW) movement used the case to highlight the systemic violence Native American women face across the United States. They emphasized that the West Mesa murders were part of a much larger epidemic of unsolved cases and unreported violence. The pressure on Albuquerque's police force was immense. A special task force was assembled to focus on the case, combining local detectives with state and federal agencies. They employed forensic experts, DNA analysts, and search teams to comb through the vast desert, looking for additional remains or evidence. New technologies, such as ground-penetrating radar, were used in an attempt to locate other burial sites. Despite these efforts, progress was slow and frustrating. The killer's identity remained elusive. Suspicions and rumors swirled throughout the community. Some speculated about the involvement of a single serial killer, with a methodical, cold-blooded modus operandi. Others suggested the possibility of a group or even a network connected to the local sex trade, possibly involving people in positions of power who helped cover up the crimes. Several persons of interest were questioned, but ultimately cleared or released due to lack of evidence. The most chilling element was the silence. The killer or killers had left little to directly link them to the crime scene. No clear DNA matches, and no witnesses willing or able to come forward. Amid the frustration, the families of the victims continued their own search for answers. Many found strength and solidarity in support groups formed by other families of missing and murdered women. They became advocates for reform, campaigning for changes in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases, particularly those involving marginalized communities. One of the most persistent questions was why these women had become targets. Experts in criminal psychology weighed in, noting that serial killers often select victims who are less likely to be immediately missed, or whose disappearances might be overlooked. Vulnerable women, especially those involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, fit this tragic profile. This cold calculation, the exploitation of invisibility, was part of the horror. These women were not just victims of a violent killer, but also of a society that allowed their vulnerabilities to be exploited and ignored. The community's response to the tragedy was complex. While grief and outrage were widespread, so too were feelings of guilt and helplessness. How had so many women gone missing without anyone realizing the scope of the danger? Could more have been done? Was justice possible? In the aftermath, Albuquerque saw increased efforts to protect and support at-risk women. Outreach programs aimed at reducing drug addiction and providing safe spaces for sex workers were expanded. Local government promised more funding for police departments to improve their response to missing persons cases. The West Mesa Bone Collector case also prompted changes on a broader level. National conversations about violence against indigenous women gained momentum. Policymakers began looking at how to improve data collection and interagency cooperation to solve cold cases and prevent future tragedies. Yet despite these positive shifts, the shadow of the West Mesa murders still looms large. The killer's identity remains unknown, and justice has not been fully served. The case is a reminder of the urgent need for vigilance, compassion, and systemic change to protect vulnerable populations. The haunting images of the desert graves and the stories of the women who once walked Albuquerque's streets continue to evoke sorrow and anger. Their lives deserve to be remembered fully, not just as statistics or victims, but as individuals with hopes, dreams, and loved ones left behind. In the final part, we will explore the lasting impact of the West Mesa Bone Collector case on families, the community, and law enforcement, as well as ongoing efforts to find answers and prevent similar tragedies in the future. The West Mesa Bone Collector case left a deep scar on Albuquerque and the broader region, one that continues to affect families, communities, and law enforcement alike. The discovery of those graves sparked not only grief and horror, but also a determined quest for justice and systemic reform. Though the killer, or killers, remain unknown, the story of the victims and their families has inspired ongoing efforts to ensure that such tragedies never happen again. For the families of the women found on West Mesa, the pain of loss was compounded by years of uncertainty and neglect. Many had filed missing persons reports, only to feel dismissed or ignored by authorities. After the discovery, some families grappled with the grim reality that their loved ones had been victims of a serial killer, while others mourned without answers, as some remains could not be conclusively identified. This mix of sorrow and frustration fueled calls for accountability. Families became vocal advocates for improved investigative procedures, especially regarding missing and murdered Indigenous women, a group disproportionately affected by violence across the United States. Organizations like the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women (MMIW) Coalition found renewed urgency in the case, highlighting its place within a broader national crisis. In response, Albuquerque law enforcement made several changes intended to rebuild public trust. Police departments introduced new training protocols focused on cultural sensitivity and handling cases involving vulnerable populations. They also began collaborating more closely with tribal law enforcement agencies to improve information sharing and joint investigations. At the state level, legislative efforts aim to increase resources for cold case units and improve data collection on missing persons. Some bills were introduced to create statewide databases that would track cases more effectively and prevent important details from falling through the cracks. Though progress was slow, these steps marked a significant shift toward acknowledging systemic failures. The case also brought attention to the importance of community involvement in crime prevention and victim support. Grassroots groups in Albuquerque and beyond organized to raise awareness about violence against women and the need for safe, accessible services. Outreach programs focused on addiction recovery, mental health support, and alternatives to sex work began receiving increased funding and visibility. One poignant aspect of the West Mesa Bone Collector story is the ongoing search for the unknown victims, whose remains were never identified. Forensic experts employed advanced techniques, including mitochondrial DNA testing and forensic anthropology, in hopes of giving names back to the anonymous graves. Identifying victims is crucial, not only for closure, but also for gathering clues about the timeline and possible suspects. The difficulty in identifying remains underscored the harsh realities faced by marginalized women, disconnected from families, lacking stable social networks, or missing for years before discovery. Each name recovered was a victory, but also a reminder of lives disrupted and questions left unanswered. The inability to conclusively identify a suspect haunted investigators and the community alike. Some believed the killer had intimate knowledge of the victims and the area, while others theorized a wider network was involved. Yet without a confession, witness testimony, or strong forensic evidence, the case remained open and frustratingly cold. In recent years, renewed interest in the case has been sparked by advances in forensic technology, such as genetic genealogy. This approach, which uses public DNA databases to trace familial relationships, has helped solve cold cases nationwide and raised hopes that it might one day lead to answers in the West Mesa murders. Investigators continue to re-examine evidence, pushing for new leads and hoping for breakthroughs. The story also inspired media attention, documentaries, podcasts, and true crime books, bringing further awareness to the victims and the issues surrounding the case. This public focus helped sustain pressure on law enforcement to remain committed and transparent. Despite the trauma and injustice, the West Mesa Bone Collector case has brought communities together in unexpected ways. Vigils, memorials, and advocacy events honor the lives lost and symbolize a collective refusal to forget. These gatherings provide healing spaces for families and communities, while reminding society of the urgent need to address violence and marginalization. The lessons from West Mesa are stark. When society neglects its vulnerable members, it creates openings for horrific violence to go unchecked. The case illustrates the dangers of assumptions, biases, and institutional indifference, especially toward those living on the margins. Looking ahead, the fight for justice and prevention continues. Families of the victims remain steadfast in their hope that someday the killer will be identified and held accountable. They demand not only answers, but also systemic change to ensure that no more women disappear without consequence or concern. Law enforcement agencies have acknowledged that closing this case is not just about solving a crime, but about restoring faith in the justice system.
They are investing in community relations, forensic innovations, and interagency cooperation to prevent similar tragedies. The West Mesa Bone Collector case is a grim chapter in Albuquerque's history, but it is also a catalyst for change. It shines a harsh light on the vulnerability of marginalized women and challenges society to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, neglect, and the value placed on human life. As time passes, the memory of the women buried in the desert remains vivid for those who loved them, and for the communities they belonged to. Their stories demand remembrance, respect, and relentless pursuit of justice. In the quiet expanse of West Mesa, where the desert winds blow over the graves of the lost, the hope persists that one day, the silence will be broken, not just by answers and accountability, but by a future where no woman's disappearance is ignored, and no life is treated as invisible.
The Edmund Kemper in the quiet town of Santa Cruz, California, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a dark presence stalked the streets. Edmund Kemper III, a man whose towering 6'9" frame masked a deeply troubled and violent mind, was responsible for some of the most horrifying crimes of the era. His story is one of tragedy, psychological torment, and unspeakable brutality that shocked a nation and forever changed the understanding of serial killers. Edmund Kemper was born in 1948 and grew up in a troubled household marked by emotional abuse and isolation. His mother, Clarnell Strandberg, was a domineering and critical woman, whose overbearing attitude and volatile temperament deeply affected Kemper's development. From a young age, Edmund was fascinated by death and violence, an interest that would eventually spiral into a chilling obsession. As a teenager, Kemper's behavior became increasingly alarming. At just 15 years old, he committed his first murders, killing his paternal grandparents. The crime was brutal, yet Kemper surrendered himself to the police immediately, expressing remorse and an inability to comprehend his own actions. This led to his commitment to a psychiatric institution, where he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but later released after only a few years, as doctors believed he had been rehabilitated. Free and living back with his mother, Kemper seemed to be on the path to normalcy, enrolling in college and holding jobs. But beneath the surface, his violent urges festered. He began frequenting bars and areas known for young female hitchhikers and college students. Kemper's height and intelligence, he had an IQ reported as high as 145, made him a deceptive predator. He was able to charm his victims before turning deadly. Between 1972 and 1973, Kemper embarked on a killing spree that terrorized the Santa Cruz community. His victims were mostly young female college students, earning him the grim nickname Co-Ed Killer. Kemper's modus operandi involved offering rides to hitchhikers or women alone, luring them to secluded areas, then strangling them. However, his crimes quickly grew more disturbing. After killing his victims, Kemper engaged in post-mortem mutilation and necrophilia, acts that horrified investigators and the public alike when the full extent was revealed. His macabre behavior extended to decapitating some victims and keeping their heads as trophies, a grotesque attempt to exert control over the young women he had taken from the world. Despite the mounting terror, Kemper was a paradoxical figure. He was highly articulate, cooperative with law enforcement when caught, and at times even charming. His confessions were detailed and candid, offering a rare insight into the mind of a serial killer. Yet, his motivations remained tangled in complex psychological wounds, particularly his fraught relationship with his mother. Kemper's killing spree finally ended in April 1973, when he turned himself in after murdering his mother and her friend. He called the police himself, directing them to the bodies. The act of killing his mother was deeply symbolic for Kemper, a culmination of years of resentment, anger, and trauma. His arrest shocked the nation. Kemper's towering stature, intellect, and calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the brutality of his crimes. The trial revealed the depths of his depravity, but also the chilling ability of a man to live among others undetected. His case became a turning point for criminal profiling and forensic psychology. In the following parts, we will explore the details of each murder, the investigation and psychological evaluation that followed, and the legacy Kemper left behind in the study of violent crime. His story remains a stark reminder of how trauma and mental illness, left unchecked, can escalate into unspeakable horror. Edmund Kemper's reign of terror in Santa Cruz was marked not only by the gruesome nature of his crimes, but also by the chilling way he managed to evade suspicion for so long. His towering height and quiet demeanor often made him seem more like a gentle giant than a monster lurking in the shadows. But behind the facade, Kemper carefully planned and executed his murders, displaying a level of cunning that baffled investigators. The first victim in Kemper's spree was an 18-year-old college student named Shari Hull. She had been hitchhiking when Kemper offered her a ride. After bringing her to a remote area, he strangled her, a method he would use consistently in many of his killings. But Shari's murder was just the beginning. Over the next year, Kemper continued his grim pattern, targeting young women who fit a specific profile, mostly female students from the nearby University of California, Santa Cruz. He stalked the campus and surrounding areas, preying on vulnerable hitchhikers and those out late at night. His crimes were methodical, luring victims into his car, driving them to secluded spots, and killing them in cold blood. But Kemper's violence didn't stop with the act of murder. His post-mortem mutilation was so disturbing that it shocked even seasoned detectives. He would often decapitate his victims and engage in acts of necrophilia. He kept some of their body parts as trophies, an attempt to hold on to control and power over the lives he had destroyed. This behavior was not uncommon among serial killers, but still deeply unsettling. The police were baffled by the murders. There were no clear suspects, and the lack of physical evidence made it difficult to link the crimes. Witnesses reported seeing a large man driving a distinctive green Volkswagen, but no one could put a name to the description. Meanwhile, the community lived in fear, as the murders seemed random and unconnected on the surface. What made Kemper's case unique was how close he came to being caught on multiple occasions. His size and intelligence meant he often appeared innocent, even friendly, allowing him to slip through unnoticed. In fact, Kemper had a criminal history, but was never considered a serious threat after his early offenses. He had been released from the psychiatric hospital, which some would later argue was a catastrophic error in judgment. One of the most chilling elements of the case was the role Kemper's family dynamics played in his crimes. His mother, Clarnell, was reportedly emotionally abusive and controlling. The tension between them was palpable, with Edmund describing her as domineering and cold. Their toxic relationship seemed to fuel his hatred and violence, culminating in his decision to murder her at the height of his spree. On the night of April 20th, 1973, Kemper committed what would be his final and perhaps most shocking murders. After killing his mother, he invited her friend to the house and murdered her as well. These killings were acts of rage, but also served as a twisted form of closure for Kemper. His mother's control over his life had been suffocating, and in his mind, her death was a way to finally break free from her grasp. The very next day, Kemper walked into the police station and confessed. He calmly detailed his crimes, offering an unnerving level of candor and insight. His willingness to turn himself in was partly driven by guilt, but also by a strange desire for notoriety. Kemper wanted the world to understand his actions, and in his own twisted way, he believed he was helping law enforcement catch other killers by sharing his story. Investigators were both horrified and fascinated by the case. Kemper's detailed confessions helped piece together the sequence of events and provided insight into the mind of a serial killer. His calm demeanor during interviews was unsettling, a stark contrast to the brutality of his actions. The legal process that followed focused heavily on Kemper's mental state. Experts debated whether he was sane enough to stand trial, or if his psychological issues mitigated his responsibility. In the end, the jury found him sane, and he was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder, receiving several life sentences. Kemper's case remains a landmark in the study of serial killers, not only for the horror of his crimes, but for the glimpse it provided into the psychological damage that can lead to such violence. His story has been referenced in numerous books, documentaries, and psychological profiles, helping to shape the way law enforcement understands and tracks serial killers. As we continue in the next parts, we will explore Kemper's early life in more detail,
the psychological evaluations that followed, and the impact his crimes had on the community and the criminal justice system. His legacy is a cautionary tale about the dangers of untreated trauma and the importance of recognizing warning signs before tragedy strikes. Edmund Kemper's childhood and early life were fraught with difficulties that foreshadowed the violent path he would eventually take. Born in 1948, Kemper grew up in a troubled household. His parents' relationship was strained, and his mother, Clarnell, was reportedly domineering and emotionally abusive. She was described by neighbors and acquaintances as overbearing and controlling, particularly towards Edmund. From an early age, Kemper exhibited disturbing behaviors. His fascination with death and violence became apparent when, as a young boy, he began torturing animals and engaging in acts of cruelty. These early signs of antisocial behavior often go overlooked, but they are significant red flags in the psychology of serial killers. Kemper's home life offered little refuge from his internal turmoil. His mother's constant belittling and harsh criticism seemed to crush any self-esteem he might have had. He later recounted how she would insult his intelligence and call him derogatory names. The toxic relationship bred resentment and anger that simmered beneath the surface, only to explode later in devastating ways. In his teenage years, Kemper's behavior escalated. At just 15 years old, he committed his first known murders, killing his grandparents. The reasons behind these killings remain somewhat unclear, but it is believed that Kemper was attempting to free himself from his oppressive mother's control by removing the family's authority figures. This early crime was shocking for its brutality, and for the fact that such a young person could commit it. Following his arrest, Kemper was institutionalized at a psychiatric hospital, where he underwent evaluations. Despite his disturbing actions, some professionals believed he could be rehabilitated. After several years in the hospital, he was released at the age of 21, a decision that many later criticized, considering what followed. His release marked the beginning of a dark chapter in Santa Cruz, California. Kemper moved back in with his mother, but soon began a series of murders that would terrorize the community. What made this spree particularly terrifying was his ability to blend into society. Kemper was well-spoken and physically imposing, standing over 6 feet 9 inches tall. This combination allowed him to lure victims without arousing suspicion. During this period, Kemper's killings became more frequent and more brutal. He targeted young women, often hitchhikers, whom he would pick up in his green Volkswagen. He would take them to secluded areas, kill them by strangulation, and then proceed with acts of mutilation. The decapitation of his victims and keeping of trophies was particularly gruesome, and a sign of his deep psychological disturbance. Kemper's fascination with death extended beyond his crimes. He had an obsession with the macabre, reading extensively about serial killers and forensic psychology. This knowledge helped him evade capture for a time, as he learned how to avoid leaving evidence that could lead police to him. Despite the horror he inflicted, Kemper sometimes appeared cooperative with law enforcement. After his arrest, he provided detailed accounts of his crimes and insights into his motives. He spoke openly about his hatred for his mother and his desire for control. This combination of openness and calculated manipulation made him a unique figure in criminal history. His confession also shed light on the psychological torment that drove him. Kemper described feeling isolated, misunderstood, and overwhelmed by his emotions. He viewed his murders as an outlet for the rage and pain he had bottled up for years. Yet at the same time, he displayed a chilling lack of empathy for his victims, seeing them as objects rather than people. The aftermath of Kemper's arrest and conviction had a profound impact on how law enforcement approached serial killings. His case underscored the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood trauma and psychological disorders. It also highlighted the need for thorough background checks and risk assessments when releasing potentially dangerous individuals from psychiatric care. Kemper's story has since been the subject of numerous documentaries, psychological studies, and even inspired fictional characters in popular culture. His case remains one of the most studied examples of the serial killer phenomenon, providing valuable lessons about the intersection of nature, nurture, and criminal behavior. As we move into the final part, We will examine the trial, Kemper's time in prison, and the broader implications of his crimes. We will also consider the legacy he leaves behind, a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human mind, and the importance of vigilance in protecting society from such threats. After Edmund Kemper's arrest and detailed confession, the judicial process began with intense scrutiny, not only of the horrific crimes, but also of Kemper's mental state and his place within the criminal justice system. His trial became a landmark case that revealed much about the complexities of criminal psychology, the legal system's handling of mentally disturbed offenders, and society's struggle to comprehend such unfathomable acts. The prosecution faced the challenge of proving Kemper's sanity at the time of the murders. While his crimes were undeniably brutal and grotesque, a key legal question was whether he was aware of the wrongfulness of his actions and capable of controlling his impulses. His detailed confessions, articulate explanations, and even apparent remorse suggested a man who understood the gravity of what he had done. Yet his documented history of mental illness and institutionalization raised questions about his culpability. Kemper's defense team argued that he suffered from severe psychiatric disorders, including psychosis and dissociative identity traits, which impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. They emphasized his traumatic childhood, the emotional abuse inflicted by his mother, and his fractured psyche as mitigating factors. However, prosecutors countered that Kemper's meticulous planning, efforts to evade detection, and calm demeanor demonstrated a clear awareness and intent. The court ultimately ruled that Kemper was sane and fully responsible for his actions. This decision underscored the legal standard that even individuals with mental illnesses could be held accountable if they possessed the capacity to understand and control their behavior. Kemper was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Despite being behind bars, Kemper's story did not fade into obscurity. Instead, he became one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, often studied for the insights he provided into the mind of a murderer. Psychologists and criminologists used his case to explore the interplay between childhood trauma, mental illness, and violent behavior. His willingness to cooperate and articulate his thoughts made him a unique subject for research. Kemper spent his life sentence in various California state prisons. Over the years, he participated in interviews, psychological evaluations, and educational programs, offering a rare window into his twisted mind. Unlike many serial killers, who remain silent or hostile, Kemper was unusually candid and sometimes reflective, discussing his motives, regrets, and perceptions of his crimes. One of the most haunting aspects of Kemper's incarceration was how he described the internal battles that preceded his killings. He spoke of feelings of rage, loneliness, and desperation, coupled with a disturbing fascination with death. He recounted his desire for control and power over others, which stemmed from the oppressive environment created by his mother. This dynamic between victim and perpetrator highlighted the cyclical nature of abuse and violence. Kemper's case also raised important ethical questions about the treatment of mentally ill offenders. Should individuals like him be confined indefinitely? Could early intervention and better psychiatric care have prevented the murders? These debates continue to influence policies and practices within forensic psychiatry and criminal justice. Public reaction to Kemper was a mixture of horror, fascination, and a quest for understanding. His crimes epitomized the darkest aspects of human nature, but they also exposed societal failures, from neglecting signs of psychological distress to systemic shortcomings in mental health care. Communities affected by his actions struggled to heal from the trauma, while law enforcement agencies used lessons from the case to improve profiling and investigative techniques. The legacy of Edmund Kemper endures in popular culture as well. He has been depicted or referenced in films, television series, and books, often symbolizing the archetype of the intelligent but monstrous killer. His life story serves as a chilling reminder of how appearances can be deceiving and how dangerous hidden wounds can become. In reflecting on Kemper's story, one cannot help but consider the broader implications for society. His crimes prompt us to ask difficult questions about prevention, detection, and rehabilitation. How can we better identify and support those at risk of violence? What responsibilities do families, communities and institutions have in protecting vulnerable individuals and potential victims? These questions remain as urgent today as they were decades ago. Ultimately, Edmund Kemper's story is not just about a series of horrific murders. It is a complex narrative about the human psyche, the consequences of trauma, and the fragile boundary between sanity and madness. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, and to strive for a society where such tragedies are less likely to occur.
In the early 1980s, a quiet Midwestern town was shaken by a series of disappearances that left residents fearful and police baffled. What made this case so unsettling was not just the number of victims, but the eerie manner in which they vanished and the strange symbols left behind at some of the scenes. This is the story of the Alphabet Murders, a case that remains one of the most perplexing and haunting unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. It began in Rochester, New York, a city known for its calm neighborhoods and close-knit communities. Between 1971 and 1973, 3 young girls, all between the ages of 10 and 11, disappeared under similar circumstances. Each girl was found murdered, their bodies discovered in nearby rural or wooded areas. What caught the attention of investigators and the public was a chilling pattern. The first and last names of each victim started with the same letter. This grim coincidence gave the case its nickname, but it was only the start of a series of baffling clues. The first victim was Carmen Colon, a bright and cheerful girl who was last seen walking home from a local school event. She vanished without a trace, and days later her body was found in a ditch, covered with debris but showing clear signs of foul play. Not long after, another girl named Wanda Walkowitz was reported missing. Her body was discovered in a field several miles from where Carmen had been found, and she too had suffered a violent death. The final known victim was Michelle Manzer, who disappeared while visiting a shopping mall. Her body was found near a construction site, again showing the same horrifying signs. All 3 girls were of similar age, disappeared from similar urban settings, and were found in relatively close proximity to one another. Police were confounded. Despite an intense investigation involving multiple agencies and hundreds of tips, the killer was never caught. The fact that the victims' names matched so perfectly seemed almost like a deliberate message from the murderer, a cruel taunt or signature left behind. But beyond that, little physical evidence was ever recovered to point investigators toward a suspect. The case was complicated by the social context of the early 1970s. Forensic technology was limited, and investigative procedures were still developing. Witnesses were often unreliable, and some reports conflicted with others. The media sensationalized the murders, which put additional pressure on law enforcement, but also led to wild speculation and false leads. Over time, theories about the killer's identity ranged from a disturbed local man with knowledge of the girls' routines to a transient passing through Rochester. Some believed the murders were ritualistic, given the eerie repetition of the victims' initials and the odd symbols occasionally reported near the bodies, though police never confirmed a connection to occult practices. The families of the victims endured unimaginable grief, while the community grappled with fear. Parents became hyper-vigilant, changing their children's routines and limiting their freedom. Local schools increased security and offered counseling to students who were deeply affected. Despite the heartbreak and frustration, the case remained open. Detectives revisited evidence as new forensic methods developed, hoping for a breakthrough. Advances in DNA analysis decades later offered a glimmer of hope, but the passage of time had degraded much of the physical evidence, making conclusive results difficult. The Alphabet Murders case also revealed troubling aspects of the criminal justice system at the time, including how certain leads were dismissed and how racial and social biases may have influenced the investigation. Some local men, often from marginalized communities, were questioned and even arrested, but charges were never filed due to lack of evidence. The town's dark chapter left an indelible mark on its identity. Books and documentaries explored the case in detail, and amateur sleuths continued to debate theories online. The victims' stories, though tragically cut short, became a rallying point for improvements in child safety and law enforcement cooperation. The mystery of the alphabet murders remains unresolved, a chilling reminder of how sometimes evil strikes quietly, leaving behind questions that haunt generations. The case stands not just as a story of loss, but as a complex puzzle where every clue, name and shadow might hold the key to finally understanding what happened. As the initial shock of the murders began to settle, the community and investigators shifted into a determined but increasingly frustrated search for answers. The police department in Rochester formed a special task force, pooling resources from local detectives, state police, and the FBI. Their goal was not only to catch the killer, but also to reassure terrified parents that justice would come. The unusual signature of the murders, the repeated first and last initials of the victims, was treated as a critical clue, a potential psychological fingerprint left behind by the perpetrator. Detectives interviewed hundreds of witnesses, including family members, friends, school teachers, and anyone who might have seen the girls on the days they disappeared. Each victim's routine was scrutinized. Carmen Collin was last seen near a small neighborhood park, walking home after an evening event. Wanda Walkowitz vanished near her neighborhood grocery store, and Michelle Manzer disappeared during a visit to the local mall. The apparent randomness of these locations suggested the killer was someone familiar with the area, comfortable moving through different parts of the city without raising suspicion. Despite this, no eyewitness accounts of suspicious behavior or persons were definitive. Some locals recalled seeing a man's vehicle parked near the areas where the girls had been last seen, but descriptions varied widely, from an older man with a beard to a younger man driving a dark sedan. The lack of consistency was frustrating and contributed to the slow pace of the investigation. The families of the victims, already devastated by the losses, became a public face for the case. They appeared at press conferences pleading for information and helped distribute flyers with the girls' pictures. Their pain was palpable, and their determination unyielding. However, as the months passed without a breakthrough, some families began to fear that the case would become just another unsolved tragedy. Adding to the complexity was the discovery of odd symbols near two of the bodies. Investigators found faint chalk-like markings etched on rocks and trees close to where Carmen and Wanda's bodies were located. These cryptic symbols resembled letters or runes, but experts disagreed on their meaning. Some believed they were random graffiti, while others speculated that the killer might have been involved in occult or ritualistic practices. This theory was both alarming and controversial, with law enforcement cautious about fueling public panic. The media frenzy surrounding the alphabet murders further complicated matters. Sensational headlines and tabloid speculation created a distorted narrative around the case. Reporters dubbed the unknown killer, the initials killer, or the ABC murderer, focusing heavily on the victims' matching initials, as if the name pattern itself was a message. This narrative captivated the public imagination, but also risked overshadowing the girls' real lives and the concrete evidence investigators were trying to piece together. Meanwhile, police encountered several dead ends with potential suspects. One man, a local known to have a violent past, was briefly detained after his car matched witness descriptions. However, without physical evidence or reliable eyewitnesses, he was released. Another suspect, a transient who had been seen near two of the crime scenes, disappeared from the area shortly after the last murder. Despite extensive searches, he was never found or conclusively linked to the crimes. One of the most controversial moments came when a man named Kenneth Bianchi, who would later become infamous as one of the Hillside Stranglers in California, was briefly investigated as a possible suspect. Bianchi was in the Rochester area during the time of the murders, and some characteristics of his later crimes matched aspects of the ABC case. However, authorities found no direct evidence connecting him to the murders of Carmen, Wanda, or Michelle, and he was ultimately cleared. The investigation also revealed troubling signs of systemic issues in law enforcement's approach. Some community members accused the police of focusing too heavily on suspects from minority or lower-income backgrounds, while failing to consider other leads. These criticisms raised questions about bias and the potential for wrongful suspicion in an already fraught atmosphere. As years passed, forensic science slowly evolved. In the 1990s and 2000s, cold case investigators reopened the files with new technologies like DNA testing. Unfortunately, much of the physical evidence collected in the 1970s had deteriorated or was never preserved adequately. Nonetheless, modern analysis helped to exclude some suspects and reinforced the belief that the killer was someone local who knew the city well. In 2011, the case took an unexpected turn when a retired detective publicly suggested the possibility that the murders were committed by more than one person or even multiple perpetrators. This theory arose because of slight differences in the modus operandi. While all victims shared the initial pattern, the details of their abductions and murders varied enough to suggest different offenders. Though this hypothesis was debated, it opened a new avenue for investigators and researchers who continue to study the case. For the families and community, the absence of closure has been deeply painful. Memorials and vigils honor the victims each year, serving as reminders of the fragile innocence lost and the enduring need for justice. Schools in Rochester teach about the case, emphasizing child safety and awareness, and there are ongoing campaigns to raise funds for missing children organizations. True crime enthusiasts and amateur detectives have also kept the story alive. Forums, documentaries, and books dissect every known fact and theory, keeping the memories of Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowitz, and Michelle Mayenza alive in the public consciousness. The case remains an unsettling reminder of how sometimes evil can strike without warning, and how even with the best intentions and efforts, justice can remain elusive. Despite the tragedy and frustration, the story of the Alphabet murders continues to resonate. It's a haunting chapter in America's true crime history that combines the heartbreak of lost childhoods with the mystery of a killer who so far has never been identified. The pattern of the victims' names, the strange symbols, and the unanswered questions all contribute to a dark legacy that challenges investigators, captivates storytellers, and moves communities to never forget. As the Alphabet murders case grew colder with time, the resolve to solve it remained strong among a small but dedicated group of law enforcement officers, amateur sleuths, and the victims' families. The frustrating reality was that after more than a decade, the trail had gone cold, and the killer had seemingly vanished without a trace. But even as hope waned, the investigation revealed more complex layers beneath the surface, involving chilling psychological insights and connections that were initially overlooked. One significant aspect that perplexed investigators was the perpetrator's apparent meticulous planning paired with moments of reckless behavior. Each of the victims was abducted from a public place, or while performing everyday activities, which made it seem like the killer was opportunistic. Yet the repeated use of the initials as a signature hinted at an obsession or compulsive behavior. This kind of symbolic calling card is often seen in serial offenders who want to taunt the police or leave a personal mark on their crimes. Psychologists and criminal profilers brought into the case offered differing views on the mind behind the murders. Some believe the killer suffered from what's known as a signature fixation, a psychological compulsion that drives them to repeat a specific pattern or ritual. This kind of behavior provides the offender a sense of control and identity, especially when the crimes involve vulnerable victims such as children. Another theory suggested that the killer's use of initials was a twisted form of control or power, almost as if the names themselves were a form of communication. This led some experts to speculate that the murders might be part of a larger symbolic or ritualistic purpose. However, no evidence of an organized cult or group involvement was ever found, and the theory remained speculative. In parallel with psychological analysis, the police also explored the possibility that the killer had some kind of connection to the victims, or at least to their families or communities. The victims, Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowitz, and Michelle Mayenza, were from diverse ethnic backgrounds, reflecting Rochester's mixed population. This raised questions about whether the murders were racially or ethnically motivated, or whether the killer specifically targeted certain communities. Despite extensive community outreach efforts, there was little concrete evidence supporting motives based on ethnicity or personal grudges. Instead, the victims appeared to be chosen primarily because of their initials and accessibility, which complicated the profile of the offender. One of the darkest revelations in the case came from the families themselves.
Many reported receiving strange phone calls, anonymous letters, and even threatening messages following the murders. Some of these communications seemed to come from someone obsessed with the case, while others appeared to be attempts to intimidate the families or steer the investigation off course. These unsettling interactions added to the trauma experienced by the families, who felt haunted not only by the loss of their children, but also by the lingering presence of someone who might be closer than anyone realized. The police kept these threats under close watch, hoping they might one day lead to identifying the person responsible. In the meantime, advances in forensic science brought new tools to the cold case. DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal investigations in the late 20th century, and by the early 2000s, cold case units had begun to re-examine evidence from decades-old crimes. Unfortunately, the physical evidence in the Alphabet murders was limited. The bodies had been discovered in wooded or isolated areas, and forensic teams had collected hair strands, fibers and some biological samples. But over time, the evidence had degraded, and contamination was a persistent problem. Still, a breakthrough seemed possible, with the emergence of familial DNA searching, a technique that could identify relatives of a suspect even if the suspect's own DNA was not in databases. This approach, however, was not widely available or legally established until well after the initial investigation had closed. While these forensic methods advanced, the story of the Alphabet murders occasionally reappeared in the media, often sparked by anniversaries or new documentary releases. True crime podcasts, books and online forums reignited public interest. Fans and armchair detectives sifted through every known fact, reanalyzing old witness statements, timelines and photographs. Some proposed new suspects or alternate theories that law enforcement had overlooked. One popular theory proposed that the murders were committed by someone who lived near the abduction sites, possibly a neighbor or local worker, who moved through the neighborhoods unnoticed. This theory stemmed from reports of a strange man seen around the areas at odd hours. Witnesses described him as middle-aged, sometimes wearing work clothes or a uniform, and often driving an unremarkable car. Yet these sightings were inconsistent and inconclusive. Another theory suggested the possibility that the murders were connected to a larger network of crimes or an underground ring involved in trafficking or exploitation. However, there was no hard evidence to link the Alphabet murders to such criminal activity. Despite the many theories, the killer's identity remained elusive. For the families, the pain of uncertainty was devastating. Each year without answers deepened the wound, creating a sense of helplessness and unresolved grief. The community struggled with a lingering fear, especially among parents worried about their children's safety. Rochester itself changed over the decades, but the shadow of the Alphabet murders lingered. Police departments maintained cold case files, occasionally revisiting the case with new eyes and new technologies. The hope remained that someday, something, a tip, a DNA match or a forgotten detail, would bring justice. Meanwhile, the victims' memories were kept alive through memorials, scholarships, and community programs aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Schools incorporated lessons on personal safety, and neighborhood watches became more active. These efforts helped channel grief into proactive protection, though nothing could undo the loss. Interestingly, the ABC pattern of the victims' names, while initially thought to be a crucial clue, came to symbolize something larger. It represented the cruel randomness of the crimes, and the way that a seemingly simple detail could hold complex psychological meaning. It also illustrated how killers sometimes use symbols or codes not just to confuse investigators, but as a way to assert dominance over their victims and the narrative of their crimes. The case remains a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by children and the relentless efforts required to seek justice. The Alphabet murders also highlight the limits of human understanding when confronted with evil that is methodical yet chaotic, symbolic yet senseless. Law enforcement professionals, psychologists, families and communities continue to wrestle with these contradictions, all while holding on to hope that one day the Alphabet murders will be solved. Until then, the case stands as a chilling testament to the enduring mystery of one of America's most haunting unsolved serial crimes. In the years following the height of the investigation, the Alphabet Murders case lingered in the public consciousness as one of the most perplexing and haunting unsolved crimes in American history. Despite the passage of decades, the unanswered questions surrounding the deaths of Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowitz, and Michelle Maenza continued to provoke speculation, sorrow, and a desperate yearning for closure. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the renewed interest in cold case investigations, driven by technological advances and changing social attitudes toward unsolved crimes. The Alphabet Murders, with its distinctive pattern and tragic victims, has become a symbol of the importance of persistence in justice, no matter how much time passes. Cold case units across the country have taken inspiration from high-profile cases where breakthroughs have come after decades, often from a single DNA match or a confession extracted from a new witness. This evolution in investigative work has kept alive the hope that even the most stubborn mysteries can eventually yield their secrets. In Rochester, law enforcement officials have continued to review the Alphabet Murders case files periodically. Advances in forensic genealogy, a method of using public DNA databases to trace familial connections, have offered new avenues for investigation. Though such efforts are painstaking and often fraught with legal and ethical challenges, the potential to identify a suspect through relatives has revitalized hopes among detectives and families alike. However, even with modern techniques, the case remains deeply challenging. The evidence is decades old, the witnesses are aging or have passed away, and the original crime scenes have long since changed. The killer, if still alive, may have moved away or died, leaving only a trail of questions and fragmented clues behind. One of the most compelling aspects of the case's legacy is the way it illustrates the complexity of profiling a serial killer who operated in a suburban setting rather than in the more stereotypical urban environments. The Alphabet Murders killer was not only elusive, but also seemed to blend into the fabric of the community. The killer's ability to evade capture for so long points to a deep understanding of the local area, social dynamics, and law enforcement practices. The victims themselves, once simply statistics in police reports, have come to represent real lives, lost potential, and the innocence shattered by violence. Memorials in Rochester honor their memory with community vigils and educational programs emphasizing the importance of child safety and community vigilance. The families of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle have remained vocal advocates for justice. Over the years, some have joined forces to raise awareness and push for new investigative efforts. Their determination has kept the story alive in newspapers, on television, and in online communities dedicated to cold cases. Moreover, the case has attracted attention from criminologists and behavioral experts, who continue to analyze the killer's possible motivations and psychological profile. The seemingly ritualistic nature of the murders has been interpreted through multiple lenses, ranging from compulsive behavior to symbolic violence. This ongoing analysis underscores a broader truth about serial crimes. They often reflect not just individual pathology, but also societal undercurrents. Issues of race, class, and childhood vulnerability intersect in ways that complicate both prevention and investigation. The ABC pattern, which once seemed a bizarre signature, remains a unique hallmark of the case. Some experts suggest that the killer's fixation on the victim's initials points to a need to assert power over identity itself, a twisted form of control where even a person's name becomes a tool of domination. This aligns with certain psychological profiles where offenders create symbolic narratives around their crimes to satisfy deeper compulsions. Yet, despite all the psychological and forensic scrutiny, the ultimate truth behind the Alphabet Murders remains just out of reach. The killer's identity, their motives, and their fate remain shrouded in mystery, leaving a void that continues to haunt Rochester and the broader true crime community. In addition to professional investigation, the rise of amateur detectives and online communities has transformed how the case is perceived. Forums and social media groups dedicated to unsolved crimes have dissected every detail of the alphabet murders. These modern detectives bring fresh eyes and diverse perspectives, sometimes uncovering new leads or suggesting overlooked connections. However, the flood of information and theories can also complicate official investigations, creating noise that can obscure facts. Law enforcement agencies must carefully balance public involvement with the integrity of their inquiries. The lasting impact of the alphabet murders also highlights the human cost of unresolved crimes. The family's experiences illustrate the prolonged trauma and frustration that accompany not knowing what happened to their loved ones or why. This pain is compounded by media attention that sometimes borders on sensationalism, reducing real people to mere elements of a mystery. Despite these challenges, the community around Rochester has found ways to honor the victims while supporting each other. Annual events, scholarships in the victims' names, and educational programs serve as reminders that while justice may be delayed, the memory of those lost endures. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about the limitations of the criminal justice system when dealing with complex serial crimes, especially those involving children. It exposes the need for better communication, resources, and community collaboration in investigating and preventing such tragedies. Finally, the alphabet murders remind us of the fragile nature of innocence and the dark shadows that can lurk even in seemingly safe communities. They challenge us to remain vigilant, compassionate, and committed to justice, no matter how long it takes. As time moves forward, so too does the hope that one day the alphabet murders will be solved, not only to bring closure to families and friends, but to provide a sense of peace to a community forever changed by this dark chapter. Until that day, the story of Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle remains a chilling echo in the annals of American true crime, a haunting reminder that some mysteries endure, beckoning us to never stop searching for the truth.
In the late 19th century, Austin, Texas was a growing city, bustling with frontier energy, but still small enough for neighbors to know each other's names. Life was rough yet familiar. But between August 1884 and December 1885, the city was terrorized by a figure whose identity would never be uncovered, a killer whose methods shocked and horrified residents, earning the dark nickname, the Servant Girl Annihilator. The murders began quietly, with the deaths of young servant women living in modest homes around Austin. The victims were attacked in their beds at night, often strangled or bludgeoned to death with blunt objects, their throats slashed. The killer seemed to hunt in darkness, slipping inside homes undetected, brutally ending lives before slipping back into the shadows. The horror quickly turned the city upside down. People barricaded doors and windows, holding vigil by candlelight. Servants and maids, already vulnerable due to their social status, feared for their lives. Families were gripped by dread, wondering who might be next. The killings were horrifyingly personal and invasive. The victims were murdered in their own beds, their sanctuaries violated. Some were raped, others mutilated in ways that suggested a deep, twisted rage. The killings were sporadic but relentless, with months sometimes passing before the next attack, but each one more savage than the last. Austin's law enforcement was overwhelmed and unprepared. Police lacked forensic tools, and the killer left no clear evidence. Rumors and fear spread quickly. Newspapers ran sensational headlines, stoking panic while demanding swift justice. The media dubbed the assailant the Servant Girl Annihilator, emphasizing the killer's apparent targeting of young female servants, though some victims were not servants, but shared similar vulnerabilities. Young women living alone or in modest conditions, often working for wealthier families. The first known victim was a young woman named Mrs. Alma Whitehead, found dead in her home in August 1884. She had been bludgeoned and strangled. Her death set off a wave of similar murders throughout the fall and winter. The killer's approach was terrifyingly methodical and stealthy. He often entered homes through unlocked windows or doors, taking advantage of the simple locks and limited security common in homes at the time. He moved quickly and without hesitation, attacking when his victims were most vulnerable, usually late at night or early morning. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the brutality without apparent motive. The murders did not involve robbery or obvious sexual assault in every case. Some victims were attacked after being restrained, others were left in strange, sometimes ritualistic positions. The city became a powder keg of fear and suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other warily, suspecting even friends and family. Vigilante groups formed, patrolling the streets at night. Innocent people were questioned, and some faced harassment based on rumors alone. Several suspects were arrested over the course of the investigation, but none were ever convicted. Some had strong alibis, others lacked evidence linking them to the crimes. The killer remained elusive. One man, a local barber named Nathan Elgin, was arrested twice in connection with the murders, largely due to circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. However, he was released due to insufficient evidence, and the killings continued, casting doubt on his guilt. The media frenzy around the case was unprecedented for Austin at the time. Newspapers printed lurid stories about the killer's supposed motives and personality, often exaggerating details to sell papers. Some accounts claimed the killer was a deranged maniac, others hinted at supernatural causes, feeding into local folklore. The case drew national attention, with detectives from other cities visiting Austin to consult. Yet despite the influx of expertise, the killer was never caught. The murders abruptly stopped in late 1885, leading some to speculate that the killer had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or moved away. The sudden end only deepened the mystery. Years later, historians and true crime writers have revisited the case, analyzing old police reports, newspaper clippings, and witness accounts. The Servant Girl Annihilator remains one of the earliest documented serial killer cases in American history, a grim precedent that foreshadowed later horrors. The victims, mostly young women with limited means, represent a forgotten group whose lives were violently ended in a city struggling with its own growing pains. Their stories echo through time as a haunting reminder of the dangers faced by vulnerable populations and the limits of justice in an era before modern forensic science. Though the killer's identity remains unknown, the legacy of fear and tragedy left behind shaped Austin's history and the way law enforcement approached violent crimes in the years that followed. The investigation into the Servant Girl Annihilator murders became one of the earliest and most complex serial killer cases in American history. The local police force, limited by the era's investigative methods and technologies, struggled to keep up with the brutality and randomness of the attacks. The city of Austin was gripped by fear, and the press exacerbated the panic by publishing sensational headlines and lurid speculation. Despite their best efforts, the police had few concrete leads. Crime scenes were often contaminated, either by curious neighbors or by the lack of an understanding of preserving evidence. In many cases, the victims' homes were small, modest dwellings, often with multiple occupants, making it difficult to establish a clear timeline or identify suspicious visitors. Additionally, the killer's ability to enter and leave homes unnoticed suggested he was familiar with the area, knew the habits of his victims, and could exploit the social vulnerabilities of the community. Several suspects were brought in for questioning over the course of the investigation. One of the earliest was Nathan Elgin, a local barber who had a history of suspicious behavior. Witnesses claimed he had been seen near some of the crime scenes, and he reportedly had a violent temper. However, police lacked physical evidence tying him to the murders. He was arrested and released twice, but ultimately no charges stuck, and the killings continued. The lack of forensic science in the 1880s made it nearly impossible to link suspects to the crimes definitively. There were no fingerprints, no DNA testing, and the concept of criminal profiling was still decades away. Investigators relied heavily on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, which was often unreliable. Some members of the community took justice into their own hands, forming vigilante patrols to guard neighborhoods at night. These groups, often armed, patrolled the streets hoping to catch the killer or deter further attacks. While their efforts were well-intentioned, they also led to increased suspicion and paranoia. Innocent people, particularly those who did not fit the typical social mold, faced harassment and accusations. The murders also exposed social tensions in Austin. The victims were predominantly young women working as domestic servants, many of them poor, vulnerable, and transient. Their low social status meant that their deaths were not always treated with the urgency or respect they deserved by the legal system. The press sometimes portrayed the victims as morally suspect, reflecting broader societal prejudices about class and gender. As the media spotlight intensified, some newspapers sensationalized the murders to boost sales. Stories of a maniac stalking the city fed public fear and led to speculation about the killer's identity. Rumors ranged from a mad doctor to a supernatural entity, mixing fact and fiction in ways that made the case even more frightening for residents. The last known murders attributed to the servant girl annihilator occurred in December 1885. After that, the killings suddenly stopped. Some speculated that the killer had died, perhaps in another incident, or was incarcerated for a different crime. Others thought he might have moved on to a new city, or even left the country. Without a suspect or solid evidence, the case went cold. Over the years, the murders have been the subject of books, documentaries, and local folklore. The victims' names like Mary Cunningham, Missouri Griffith, and Susan Hancock are remembered as tragic figures caught in the grip of a terrifying predator. The mystery of the servant girl annihilator remains unsolved to this day. Modern criminologists have analyzed the case, looking at patterns and comparing it to other early serial killers. The modus operandi, the method of attacking women in their homes, often at night, with extreme violence, foreshadowed the behaviors of later infamous killers. The case is seen as an early example of serial murder in the United States, highlighting the challenges faced by law enforcement before the advent of modern investigative tools. The story also serves as a chilling reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by women, especially those in lower social strata, and the societal failures to protect them. The killer exploited these vulnerabilities with terrifying efficiency. Despite the passage of more than a century, the servant girl annihilator case continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts and historians alike. It remains a grim chapter in Austin's history, and a haunting example of a predator who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of sorrow and unanswered questions. The servant girl annihilator case, long cold and cloaked in mystery, has invited countless theories and retrospective analyses over the years. Modern criminologists and historians have sifted through the scant evidence, witness statements, and newspaper reports from the 1880s to try to piece together who the killer might have been and what drove him to such horrific acts. One theory suggests the killer may have had military experience or some form of combat training. The brutality and precision of the attacks, often carried out in confined spaces like bedrooms, hinted at someone with an understanding of anatomy or how to inflict maximum harm quickly. The fact that several victims were strangled or bludgeoned before being stabbed or slashed suggested a controlled rage, an intent to incapacitate swiftly before the final act of violence. Others speculate the killer was a drifter or transient, someone familiar with the city, but not rooted in the community, which allowed him to move undetected and avoid suspicion. Austin in the 1880s was growing rapidly, with new neighborhoods and a shifting population. The killer may have exploited this flux, targeting vulnerable women whose social isolation made them easier prey. Another line of thought considers that the servant girl annihilator might have been multiple people, or a group rather than a lone individual. The sheer volume of attacks over such a short period, and the geographical spread across the city, have led some to question whether one person could have committed all the crimes. However, the consistent modus operandi and victim profile argue strongly for a single perpetrator. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the apparent taunting of the police and public by the killer. There were reports of anonymous letters sent to newspapers, purportedly from the murderer, boasting about the crimes and daring the authorities to catch him. These letters, often filled with gruesome details, intensified the public's fear and the media frenzy, but were never definitively linked to the killer. In recent years, some true crime researchers have revisited the suspect files and police records, looking for clues missed at the time.
Nathan Elgin, the barber initially questioned, remains a figure of interest. Some historians note that his violent temper and erratic behavior fit the profile of the killer, but without physical evidence or eyewitnesses conclusively placing him at crime scenes, the case against him was circumstantial at best. Other suspects considered included local men with criminal records or known violent tendencies. One theory posits a disgruntled ex-servant or former employer might have sought revenge against the servant class. However, no definitive suspect ever emerged, and many leads were dead ends. The social context of Austin in the 1880s also complicates the case. Racial and economic divides shaped the community and influenced police work. Many of the victims were women of color or recent immigrants, which may have affected the thoroughness of the investigation and the urgency with which the crimes were pursued. The case's notoriety also brought national attention to Austin, affecting its reputation for years. The city's leaders and residents sought to distance themselves from the horror, emphasizing progress and law enforcement reforms. Police began experimenting with new investigative techniques, including early forms of surveillance and record keeping, as a direct result of the failures exposed by the case. Culturally, the servant girl annihilator has become part of American folklore, a dark shadow over Austin's history. The murders inspired later fictional works, including early detective novels and horror stories that played on the fear of an unseen killer lurking in ordinary homes. The case's ambiguity, no confirmed killer, no clear motive, has made it a touchstone for exploring the psychology of fear and the nature of evil. In the 21st century, advances in forensic science sparked hopes that new techniques could shed light on the case. Although no physical evidence remains intact, researchers have examined the locations, victim profiles, and historical context to create detailed criminal profiles. Some experts suggest the killer could have been a local man with obsessive tendencies, possibly a frustrated or rejected suitor of one of the victims, but without DNA or fingerprints, this remains speculative. Community efforts to remember the victims have increased, with local historians and advocacy groups pushing for memorials and greater recognition. The tragedy of these young women, largely forgotten in the rush of history, is slowly being acknowledged with dignity and respect. The servant girl annihilator murders also serve as an early example of the challenges in solving serial killings: limited technology, social biases, and the difficulty of gathering reliable evidence. The case helped pave the way for future developments in criminal justice, highlighting the need for better investigative methods and greater protection for vulnerable populations. Despite the passage of more than a century, the fear that gripped Austin in 1884-1885 remains palpable in retellings of the story. The image of a shadowy figure slipping silently into homes, striking without warning, taps into primal fears of invasion and violence within the supposed safety of one's sanctuary. In sum, the servant girl annihilator case remains a haunting mystery. It challenges us to remember the victims, not just as statistics or headlines, but as individuals whose lives were violently cut short. The story warns of the dangers of social neglect and the consequences of injustice, reminding us that even in the past, darkness lurked just beneath the surface of everyday life. The servant girl annihilator killings ended as mysteriously as they began. After the final brutal murder on Christmas Eve of 1885, the killing of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, Austin never again experienced another string of murders with such a distinct ritualistic pattern. The sudden silence in the wake of the horror left residents bewildered, and police even more so. Had the killer left town, died, been imprisoned for some unrelated crime? No one could say for certain. What remained was a chilling absence, a void of answers that only deepened the fear and fascination surrounding the case. In the months that followed the last known killings, the city slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. But for the families of the victims, and for the Black and immigrant communities disproportionately affected by the violence, the trauma lingered far longer. The women who died, Many of them working as domestic servants in white households were mourned quietly, their names slipping out of public conversation as the years went on. In many ways, the case was a harbinger of how marginalized victims in American history are often forgotten or overlooked, their stories buried in archives and yellowed newspaper clippings. Austin's law enforcement, having been exposed for its shortcomings, attempted to modernize. They introduced stricter patrol routes, expanded their investigative efforts, and even sought guidance from lawmen in other cities who had dealt with violent crimes. But despite these changes, the damage had been done. Austin's sense of safety had been shattered, and trust in the police had plummeted. The servant girl annihilator case faded from the national spotlight. In an age before centralized police records, before criminal profiling or fingerprint databases, the case lacked the forensic backbone required for a successful prosecution. Over time, the murders became more legend than case file, a tale whispered by historians, true crime writers and folklore collectors. But the story never disappeared entirely. In the 20th century, with the rise of criminal psychology and forensic science, the case was revisited. One theory even linked the servant girl annihilator to another infamous killer, Jack the Ripper. The connection was speculative but chilling. Jack the Ripper began his killings just 3 years after the Austin murders ended. Both targeted women, often mutilating the bodies with terrifying precision. Both were never caught, and both crimes occurred in rapidly industrializing cities, grappling with immigration, poverty, and class tensions. Some theorists posited that the annihilator left Texas and moved to London. The idea was largely based on circumstantial timelines and stylistic similarities between the crimes, but it captured the imagination of true crime enthusiasts worldwide. Could the two most notorious uncaught killers of the 19th century be one and the same? It remains an enduring mystery. Others, however, argue for a simpler explanation. Perhaps the killer was local, and either died, was imprisoned for another crime, or was institutionalized. Some researchers point to records of mentally ill men arrested around the time of the final murders. Others believe the murderer may have been a respected figure in the community, someone above suspicion. This theory ties into the boldness of the attacks, striking homes, sometimes in wealthier neighborhoods, with no apparent fear of being caught. The psychological profile of the killer, built retrospectively by modern criminologists, describes a man in his 20s or 30s, likely socially isolated, perhaps experiencing psychosis or a violent compulsion. The calculated nature of the attacks suggests intelligence and planning, while the brutality indicates deep-seated rage. The murderer may have been fixated on women he perceived as vulnerable, or symbolic of something he despised. Cultural fascination with the case has also continued. In books, podcasts, and even fictional retellings, the servant girl annihilator lives on as a symbol of unknowable evil, the killer who vanished into the fog of history. Austin itself has embraced the mystery in some ways. Ghost tours reference the crimes. True crime authors explore the case in local bookstores. Historians include it in lectures on 19th century Texas. But even in the midst of fascination, the weight of the tragedy remains. 8 women, perhaps more, died horrific deaths. Their lives were more than their final moments. They were daughters, mothers, wives, and workers. Each had a name and a story, even if those details are lost or fragmented today. Re-examining the case isn't just about chasing the ghost of a killer. It's also about reclaiming the stories of those victims, and remembering the way societal neglect may have enabled such violence to continue for so long. In more recent years, some efforts have been made to officially memorialize the victims. Historical societies have gathered the known names of the murdered women and petitioned for their stories to be included in public education. Some scholars now teach the case as part of a larger discussion about violence against women, especially women of color, in American history. The case also offers valuable insight into how law enforcement and journalism evolved. Newspapers of the 1880s, though often sensational, played a major role in documenting the crimes. Their vivid and sometimes inaccurate reporting created a public record that later historians would come to rely on, but they also reveal the racial biases and class assumptions of the time, details that help us better understand why certain victims were ignored or misrepresented. If there's one thing the Servant Girl Annihilator case leaves behind, it's the reminder that justice isn't just about finding a killer, it's about how society responds to violence. Do we protect the most vulnerable? Do we hold institutions accountable? Do we remember the forgotten? For Austin, the echoes of the past remain, though the city has transformed drastically since those dark years. What was once a small and unsettled capital is now a thriving metropolis. Skyscrapers loom over neighborhoods that in the 1880s were dusty and dimly lit. But beneath the sidewalks and modern glass buildings lie the same streets once walked by a killer no one ever found. And so the story endures, not just as a tale of murder, but as a haunting chapter in the long and complex history of American crime. The Servant Girl Annihilator, whoever he was, has become more than a man. He is a question left unanswered, a shadow that never lifted, a warning carved in silence. And until his identity is uncovered, if ever, the mystery will remain one of the darkest and most haunting in the annals of American true crime.
The Gilgo Beach serial killer. In May 2010, 23-year-old Shannon Gilbert disappeared in Oak Beach, Long Island, after a mysterious 911 call in which she claimed she was being followed. While searching for her, authorities stumbled upon the bodies of 4 other women, bound and hidden in dense shrubbery near Gilgo Beach. These 4, Maureen Brainard Barnes, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman and Amber Lynn Costello, represented the beginning of a chilling and expansive serial murder case that would come to involve at least 11 victims. All 4 disappeared between 2007 and 2010 while advertising as escorts online, often using Craigslist. Their bodies were discovered wrapped in burlap or tied with leather belts, stripped of clothes, and disposed of along a short stretch of highway and adjacent wooded areas. The discovery triggered searches and forensic efforts, but progress was slow. Initially, investigators treated the deaths as isolated crimes, in part due to the victims' marginalized professions and limited media attention. As weeks passed, 6 additional sets of remains were found, some dating back as early as 1993. Their remains included Jessica Taylor, disappeared 2003, Valerie Mack, Sandra Costier, 1993, and unidentified individuals dubbed Peaches Doe, a toddler referred to as Baby Doe, and one identified as Asian Doe. The identification of Karen Vergata, formerly Fire Island Jane Doe, came later in 2023 via genetic genealogy. Meanwhile, Shannon Gilbert's remains surfaced in a marsh in December 2011, nearly a year after the other murders were uncovered. Authorities ruled her death accidental, but her family contested that conclusion, believing she may have been another victim. The cases eventually connected through burial sites, victim similarity, disposal patterns, and forensic matches. Community activists and the victims' families grew increasingly vocal, challenging law enforcement to pursue justice rather than dismiss or fragment the investigation. In early years, local police clashed with advocates and media over pace and priorities. Missing persons reports tied to sex work were frequently ignored or deprioritized. Only after public pressure did authorities form a multi-agency task force. A breakthrough came when investigators rediscovered older case files and witness statements referencing a tall man driving a Chevrolet Avalanche. That vehicle model would later be central to linking suspect Rex Horriman to the crimes. Families continued to organize, holding vigils and demanding systemic change in how investigations handle marginalized victims. By 2022, with cooperation from Suffolk County Police, Nassau Police and NYPD, the Gilgo Task Force traced the Chevrolet Avalanche to Massapequa Park architect Rex Horriman. He was arrested in mid-2023 and ultimately charged with 7 murders spanning 1993 to 2010. Evidence cited included DNA from rootless hair samples, cell phone records, surveillance video, and a disturbing planning document found on his personal computer that appeared to detail methods of abduction, dismemberment, and body disposal. The indictment cracked open the case publicly. Prosecution emphasized DNA match statistics and the consistency of victim disposal, while defense attorneys questioned the validity of new whole genome DNA software used in analysis, citing software updates and reliability concerns. Horriman pleaded not guilty. Although charged in 7 murders, investigators believed he may be tied to more cold case deaths, possibly even those previously dismissed. As of early 2025, 4 of the discovered remains remain unidentified or uncharged: Peaches, Baby Doe, Asian Doe, and the murdered Karen Vergata. The media coverage and advocacy surrounding the case intensified, especially following a 2025 docuseries that refocused public scrutiny on the earlier missteps and bias toward victims. Families remain persistent, pushing for further charges, survivor protections, and legal reforms. Each of the named victims had her own story. Maureen Brain Barnes, a young mother juggling hardship and love; Melissa Bartholomew, who left the Bronx to pursue independence; Megan Waterman, a recent college graduate; Amber Costello, who sought better opportunities on Long Island. All had stepped into sex work briefly, often with financial desperation in mind, and all vanished quietly while advertising online. Maureen disappeared in mid-2007, and in 2010 her body was found restrained and bundled. Later, DNA from the leather belt around her wrist revealed familial connections with Horriman's wife, strengthening prosecutorial arguments that he was intimately linked to the crime. Melissa, gone mid-2009, was one of the first bodies discovered. Her family began receiving harassing calls traced back to burner phones allegedly tied to Horriman. Megan vanished after leaving a Long Island hotel in June 2010, while Amber disappeared in September of that year after visiting a beach town. Despite these emerging patterns, early police response was fragmented. Law enforcement treated escorts' disappearances as personal matters rather than urgent homicide investigations, reflecting systemic bias. Only when multiple bodies appeared along the same stretch did police initiate a unified task force. In early 2011, the discovery of additional remains stretching back years expanded the case's scope. Jessica Taylor's torso, dated from 2003, Sandra Costier's dismembered remains from 1993, and the unidentified victims, including a toddler Baby Doe and a transgender individual, Asian Doe, reinforced the idea of a long-term killer exploiting weak investigation protocols and societal neglect. Genetic genealogy helped identify Karen Vergata by 2023, illustrating the case's evolution. Shannon Gilbert's status remained contested. Found drowned in a marsh, investigators ruled it an accident, but her final moments, captured in a panicked 911 call, remain unsettling. Her disappearance was the catalyst for uncovering other bodies but remains unresolved. Investigators re-examined witness tips from earlier years: a tall man with bushy hair driving a Chevy Avalanche, sometimes seen at victim drop zones or shopping areas. These descriptions had been filed but overlooked by earlier detectives. Renewed focus on the vehicle led to tracing registered avalanches in the area. One such vehicle matched Horriman's later. Crucial evidence emerged from Horriman's home search. A document detailed how to remove identifying marks from victims, select suitable dump sites, and avoid detection after dismembering bodies. It included chilling lines like "Get sleep before hunt," and instructions for removing tattoos. The document had been saved and updated over years. Investigators also recovered disturbing digital content, pornography, photos, records of infrared mapping of remote areas, and potential victim fantasies. Investigators interviewed nearly 300 incarcerated sex workers, discovering around 15 credible reports of odd encounters with a client matching Horriman's description, often involving anxiety, strange questions, or instructions to drive to remote areas. These first-hand accounts lent weight to forensic theories. A persistent challenge is the defense's attack on genome sequencing via hair samples. The method produced staggering probability statistics, but critics argue the software used underwent numerous revisions, potentially compromising reliability. A legal ruling on this evidence could make or break the prosecution. Families of the victims have remained integral to the investigation's moral underpinnings. Initially marginalized, they took leadership, forming the Gilgo Beach Victim Family Coalition. They pushed for advocacy laws to protect sex workers, improved missing persons protocols, and permanent fund support for cold cases. Their persistence forced public accountability and reignited the investigation after years of stagnation. Meanwhile, cold case investigators expanded efforts on other Long Island beaches, reviewing unidentified remains, missing persons dating back decades, and leads previously discarded. The possibility that Horriman may be responsible for more victims remains under exploration. Through community activism, legislative lobbying, and public pressure, the story of Gilgo Beach has reshaped perspectives on how society and institutions protect or fail vulnerable individuals. The early months of 2025 centered on courtroom strategy and legal contestation over key evidence. The judge presided over a Fry hearing to determine whether whole genome sequencing from rootless hair is admissible in New York criminal courts. Defense attorneys argued that the method, while scientifically advanced, was not fully validated for legal standards, and that software glitches called the results into question. Prosecutors focused on the DNA's astronomical match probabilities, coupled with corroborating mitochondrial sequencing. They emphasized that the hair found on multiple victims matched the suspect's unique profile and could only be someone in his immediate family, which, given territorial data, pointed squarely at Horriman. Defense requested separate trials for earlier victims, arguing their deaths in the 1990s and early 2000s might muddle the jury's perception when combined with later Gilgo area murders. Prosecutors insisted a single trial reflects how the killings spanned decades, but followed consistent behavioral patterns: disposal sites along Ocean Parkway, use of burner phones, vehicle sightings, and the chilling blueprint document found on his hard drive. Witness testimony from surviving escort workers added emotional and practical weight. Many spoke of being approached by a man offering high payment, then asking them to drive to isolated locations. Others described intrusive or threatening behavior, encouraging investigators to treat sex worker accounts with gravity. Horriman's estranged wife publicly defended her husband's character, maintaining that domestic evidence proved his innocence, even as she kept her public statements limited. The couple's children remain out of public view, navigating the pain privately. Meanwhile, investigators revisited cold cases linked to the suspect's past, cases involving unknown remains found near manor areas, suitcases washed ashore, or human remains found along Jones Beach. Although no additional charges have been filed beyond the original 7 counts, detectives continue exhuming leads and using genealogical tools to trace possible victims. On the advocacy front, the victims' families have taken on a legislative role. They helped pass bills ensuring that families of missing sex workers receive equal investigative resources. They pushed for reforms in how police departments triage missing persons reports, and introduced legislation mandating better cooperation among islands, counties, and city sessions. Publicly, the case has influenced culture. True crime podcasts, films, and documentaries have featured the story to highlight how sexism, classism, and stigma delayed recognition of a serial killing network. Artists have created public murals honoring the Gilgo 4 and other victims, while social media campaigns pressured authorities to release more case files and ensure transparency during trial proceedings. Legal experts now cite the Gilgo Creek trial as a landmark for future forensic jurisprudence. If unique DNA sequencing evidence is admitted, it may open doors for similar technology in cold cases nationwide. If courts reject it, prosecutors will need to pivot to circumstantial evidence, physical presence, communications trails, planning documents, and consistent patterns, risking lesser clarity. Throughout delays, pre-trial motions, and discovery battles, the families remain central. They fulfill dual roles as grieving loved ones entrenched in legal strategy,
and as activists demanding broader reforms. Time and again, they voice resistance to sensationalizing their personal pain, insisting the trial be grounded in truth, justice, and memory preservation. The trial's projected timeline, delayed pending rulings on legal motions, has shifted anticipated hearing dates into early 2026. Meanwhile, media coverage remains intense, with every pre-trial submission and expert hearing drawing national attention. Journalists frame the case not just as a gruesome set of murders, but as an indictment of delayed recognition and institutional marginalization. In early 2026, the case transitions from investigation to trial, whether the genome sequencing evidence will be permitted, and whether the trial will proceed with all 7 counts or separated into clusters, will shape its outcome and broader legal precedent. Jurors will weigh expert testimony, digital artifacts, witness statements, and documentary evidence. Prosecution will likely present forensic evidence, the hair DNA, cell phone logs linking Horriman to burner phones used by victims, surveillance footage of a Chevy Avalanche at times and places corresponding to some victims' disappearance, and the blueprint document in which he outlines methods of disposal and avoidance. They will weave an argument that connects his home work routines and access to concealment locations in Suffolk and Nassau counties. Defense strategy aims to humanize Horriman, portraying him as a long-term community member, family man and professional architect. They may argue that the document and digital records reflect fantasy rather than reality, not genuine planning names but horrific imagination, and that DNA results are flawed without full validation. They will emphasize the possibility of contamination, coincidence, or the software's uncertainty. Separately, the argument over severing victim clusters may allow jurors to focus on discrete timelines, earlier victims 1993, 2003 versus later victims 2007-2010, possibly minimizing emotional bleed from one cluster to another. Defense hopes to challenge the common narrative tying all victims together. Prosecution insists coherence across decades demonstrates a single perpetrator. Ethically and socially, the trial spotlights marginalized voice rights. Families are drawing attention to how sex workers' disappearances were previously dismissed, and how the case's eventual breakthrough relied on victim advocacy, public pressure, and advances in forensic genetics. Legislators in New York and other states are studying the case to accelerate reforms in missing persons reporting, forensic resources, and systemic accountability. When marginalized communities are targeted, the cultural legacy is already cemented. The case has featured in improv legislative hearings, university curricula on forensic ethics, and public exhibitions honoring the victims. Podcasts analyzing the trial, documentaries revisiting early mistakes, and journalistic books exploring sex worker advocacy have reframed the narrative around systemic injustice rather than serial killer mythology. Legally, the decision on genome sequencing may guide future prosecutions, either by expanding admissible forensic tools or reinforcing limits of court-accepted science. Reference materials and law journals widely discuss it as potentially comparable to other landmark cases on digital evidence or polygraphic standards. For Long Island, the Gilgo Beach case's outcome will resonate beyond conviction. If Horriman is convicted on all counts, families and advocates will take it as hard-won justice and proof that perseverance matters. If evidence is thrown out or convictions scaled back, the case may shift to a broader conversation about whether marginalized victims ever really received equal protection under the law. For the public, the trial transforms from cold case files to a human story, one about 7 women with names, histories, families, and futures cut short, about societal neglect that allowed crimes to persist, and about modern justice colliding with centuries-old bias. The families remain committed to ensuring this moment doesn't fade into legal obscurity. They continue to demand transparency, reform, and memorials that preserve their loved ones' names beyond headlines. Regardless of the verdict, the Gilgo Beach murders have already reshaped the conversation on how we treat vulnerable cases. Victim advocacy laws, police training reforms and legislative proposals now bear their imprint. The trial itself is likely to feature in legal textbooks and forensic ethics modules for years. And so as the courtroom opens and witnesses begin to testify, the world watches not merely a murder trial, but a reckoning with justice, memory, science and change. For the families, persistence isn't about revenge, it's about recognizing lives lost and preventing future tragedies. The Gilgo Beach case is still unfolding, but one clear outcome is already certain: this story will not be buried quietly.